Part 1. The Hill No One Claimed. The wind in Clearwater Pass had a voice of its own, long, low, and tired, as if it had been sighing through the mountains long before people arrived to listen. Late autumn of 1907 brought that familiar sound back again. Snow that had fallen weeks earlier still clung to the ground in stubborn patches, frozen hard as stone. The air was thin, sharp, restless, the kind of cold that bit through wool and bone alike. Most folks in the valley hurried through days like this, but not Elias Rowan. At just 16, the youngest soul living near the pass was already used to the cold, used to the silence, used to being overlooked. That morning, Elias was checking a line of rabbit snares along the ridge, his boots crunching over frost as he walked. A gray sky pressed low overhead. His breath drifted in pale clouds. The cold was ordinary. What he was about to find was not. One of the snares had been dragged halfway into the hillside, fresh claw marks, dirt scattered. "Fox," he muttered softly, but when he knelt and pushed his hand into the torn opening of soil, he felt something strange. The earth inside wasn't frozen. He pulled back, frowning. The topsoil was rock-hard, brittle with ice, but deeper, just a few inches under, it was dry. Warm? No, but not dead. Not locked in winter like everything else around it. He dug further with his fingertips, breaking apart clods of earth. Still dry. A breeze swept across the ridge, pushing his hair aside. Elias lifted his head, watching how the wind moved. Across the slope. Not against it. It slid along the hill's curve and slipped away, never striking the surface directly. He rose slowly, brushing dirt off his hands, looking at the hill as if seeing it for the first time. Most people passed by this slope without a second thought. Just another mound of earth, another patch of stubborn pine roots clutching onto the hill for dear life. Another forgotten corner of a valley, too harsh for most. But Elias wasn't most. He stepped closer, placing his palm on the hillside. Beneath the crust of cold, he felt structure, tightly woven roots, layers of compacted soil. The kind that had held together for decades, maybe centuries. A natural wall, a natural shelter, or something that could become one. He whispered to himself, "This isn't dead earth. It's alive." He crouched again, pushing deeper into a weak spot in the slope, widening it with careful, deliberate movements. And the hill surprised him again. No icy clumps. No moisture seeping through, just firm, dry ground. Protected, preserved. A place the winter hadn't claimed. Elias leaned back on his heels, staring at the slope with a slow, forming sense of recognition, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The hill wasn't empty, he murmured. It was just forgotten. Something tightened in his chest. Not fear, not excitement, but a quiet certainty he couldn't explain yet. He stood there for a long minute, letting the idea bloom in the cold air. The idea that the hill was offering him something. A possibility nobody else could see. The sky darkened slightly as another wind gust swept across the ridge. Snowflakes stirred, dancing over the ground. The world felt bigger and heavier, and somehow clearer than it had minutes before. Finally, Elias stepped back from the slope. And in that moment, barely 16 years old, alone on a ridge most grown men avoided in winter, he made a decision no one would understand. Not yet. He slung the empty snare line over his shoulder and whispered under his breath, as if the hill itself might be listening. "I'm coming back." Mini cliffhanger. He walked away from the hillside, but the idea stayed behind him like a shadow, quiet, stubborn, unshakable. A 16-year-old boy had just chosen to return to a place no adult believed was safe. And winter was coming. Part 2. A boy with no say. Elias Rowan didn't go back to the hill that same day. Not because he doubted what he'd found, but because of the one thing a 16-year-old in Clearwater Pass could never escape: the town itself. Clearwater was small, maybe 30 families scattered along the valley, bound together by winters so harsh they erased anything that wasn't rooted deep. In a place like that, reputation mattered, tradition mattered, age mattered most. And Elias had none of the three. He pushed open the door of the mercantile, brushing frost from his sleeves. The bell above the door gave a tired clang. Inside, the smell of kerosene, leather, and drying pine needles mixed in the cold air. Old Mr. Barnes, the shopkeeper, looked up from sorting nails into jars. "Well now," he said, squinting over his spectacles, "if it ain't young Rowan. Winter's coming quick, boy. You stocking up for your uncle?" Elias shook his head. "I need lumber, a few beams, some planks, maybe tar cloth." Barnes raised a gray eyebrow. "You building something?" Elias hesitated. He felt the idea sitting warm and alive beneath his ribs, but saying it aloud felt too early. "A shelter," he finally said. Barnes scratched his beard. "You're 16. You can't buy lumber without a sponsor. Come back with an adult." "I have money," Elias argued softly. He pulled out a small cloth pouch, savings from trapping rabbits and cutting firewood for neighbors. Barnes sighed. "That's not the point. Ain't about money. It's about judgment. And you're still just a—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Just a boy. The words hung between them like frost. Elias stood there for a few helpless seconds, then nodded and walked back out into the cold. Later that afternoon, he found himself at the edge of a town hall gathering. Men huddled near the stove in the old meeting shed, discussing winter stores and snowpack forecasts. He lingered outside, listening through the cracked window. "Snow's coming earlier this year," one man said. "Rail line might close before December," another replied. Elias cleared his throat. "Excuse me." Heads turned toward him. "I found something up near the ridge," he said quietly. "A hill with warm soil. It might work as a shelter." Laughter cut him off. Tom Reddick, a farmer with hands like tree roots, shook his head. "Son, every hill feels warm if you dig wrong." Another voice. "He's just spooked 'cause winter took his daddy 2 years back." More murmurs. Pity. Dismissal. Someone added under their breath, "Digging into dirt for shelter. That's burying yourself alive." The words stung more sharply than the cold outside. Elias stepped back from the doorway, cheeks burning, throat tight. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he felt something else. Invisible. A boy with no vote, no authority, no right to speak on winter. He walked away, pulling his coat tighter around himself, breath shaking in the air. He didn't notice the man standing beside the shed until a low, seasoned voice broke the silence. "You're not wrong, boy." Elias turned. Caleb Horn leaned on his cane, snowflakes gathering on the brim of his hat. A veteran of the Spanish-American War, Caleb had seen more hardship than the rest of the valley combined. One leg bad, lungs worse, but his eyes were steady. "You've dug into the ridge before?" Caleb asked. Elias swallowed. "No, not like today." Caleb nodded slowly. "I lived in earth shelters once, in Cuba. Dirt's smarter than folks think. Keeps heat, breaks wind, saves lives when wood won't." Elias felt a tiny spark of hope. "So you believe me?" Another slow nod, then a sigh. I believe the land can teach. But belief ain't the same as support. His gaze shifted toward the town meeting behind them. They won't listen. Not to you. Not yet. 16's too young for men who think they've got winter figured out. Elias clenched his jaw. So what do I do? Caleb looked him straight in the eye. You do it anyway, but don't expect help. And with that, the old soldier turned and limped away, leaving Elias alone on the snowy street. The sun slipping behind the mountains, shadows stretching long across the valley. The next morning, Elias returned to the mercantile once more, this time with a different request. I need rope, he told Mr. Barnes. That you can buy, Barnes replied, and a shovel, and a hatchet. No lumber. Barnes frowned, but handed over the items. Elias paid every cent he had, walked out the door, and tightened his grip on the tools. They were small, inadequate, not nearly enough for what he imagined. But they were his, and no one could take them away with a half-pitying glance or a rule about age. He turned toward the ridge, the wind biting at his cheeks, the sky the color of pewter, and began the long climb back to the forgotten hill. He was 16. He had no vote, no say, no permission. But Winter didn't care about permission, and Elias Rowan was done waiting for adults to believe him. He would listen to the land himself, even if he had to do it alone. Part 3. The Backwards Shelter. Elias reached the base of the hill just as the light began to fade, a pale gold slipping behind the chestnut ridge. The world was quiet there, the kind of quiet that makes a boy feel as though the land itself is holding its breath. He stood for a long moment, studying the slope. Most folks in Clearwater built upward, cabins on stilts, roofs pitched steep to shed snow, walls thick with pine sap. But the hill was offering something different. Not a house standing against winter, a house inside winter. Elias set his tools down and placed both palms against the cold soil. It felt solid, steady, unmoving, and beneath that thin, frozen skin, he knew warmth still lingered in the roots and earth. He whispered to himself, as if reminding his own doubt, earth keeps heat better than air. Snow keeps heat better than wood. And the wind can't hit what it can't reach. With that, he took his first swing. The shovel broke through the surface crust with a hard crack, like striking old bone. Elias dug again. And again. Each thrust sent tremors up his arms, numbing his fingers. By the third hour, his breath came in sharp bursts. His coat was dusted with frost. His hands were raw, small fissures opening along his knuckles, stinging with every movement. He worked anyway. Somewhere far below the hill, Clearwater Pass carried on with its late autumn routines. Smoke curled from cabin chimneys. Livestock were driven toward winter pens. Children hurried home before dark. But up on the ridge, no one saw a boy trying to carve a life out of frozen earth. He widened the opening bit by bit, hauling out clumps of soil with his bare hands when the shovel grew too cold to grip. His breath fogged the air in front of him. Mud mixed with blood in the creases of his fingers. Still, he dug. When his arms trembled, he stopped only long enough to rub warmth back into his palms, then began again. The earth gave way slowly, stubbornly, as if testing whether he truly meant it. He did. By the third day, the opening had grown deep enough for him to crouch inside. The wind flowed past the hill like water around a stone. Inside the cut, it was silent. Eerily so. He pressed his back against the inner wall. Dry, firm, protected. A place winter couldn't quite touch. Elias needed timber next. Not for a roof, but for support beams within the shelter itself. He walked miles downriver to gather what he could find. Driftwood, snapped limbs, anything sturdy enough to serve. He hoisted each piece over his shoulder and carried it back in aching batches. Sometimes he dragged them. Sometimes he slipped and tumbled down icy slopes, skinning his elbows, bruising his shins. But he didn't stop. He used the thicker branches to form a rough rib cage of support. Rope lashed them together. Roots from the hillside wove naturally among the beams, tightening the structure like fingers interlacing. A backward shelter, he thought, built into the ground rather than rising above it. Everything about it defied the way Clearwater Pass had built for generations. But that was the point. People passed sometimes, hunters returning from the ridge, farmers checking their trap lines. They always slowed, always stared. "Digging yourself a grave, boy?" one man called, half amused. Another shook his head. If dirt was safe, we'd all be living underground. A pair of women on horseback murmured to each other as they rode past. "He's still grieving. Poor child. Leave him be." Winter took his father. Now it's taking his sense. Elias heard every word. None of it stopped him. If anything, it rooted him deeper into the soil he was carving open. Soil that didn't mock, didn't dismiss, didn't underestimate him just for being 16. By the 6th day, the shelter took shape. A hollowed-out chamber big enough for one person to lie down, reinforced by ribs of timber, warm compared to the outside air. Elias lit a small candle and set it inside. The flame flickered a moment, then steadied. No wind, no draft, just stillness. A stillness unlike anything above ground. He sat back on his heels, exhausted, but certain. "This will work," he whispered. And for the first time, he believed it without needing anyone else to. But as he stepped out from the hillside and looked toward the valley, he noticed something that made his breath hitch. The sky over Clearwater Pass had begun to turn a strange color. An iron gray he recognized too well. The kind of sky that didn't promise snow, but storms. Not weeks from now. Not deep in winter. Soon. The wind carried a new sound, too. Thin, high, and unsettling. A warning. Elias wiped the dirt from his hands, staring at the ridge below him. Winter wasn't waiting this year, and neither could he. Part 4. When winter took the pass, the first flakes fell 2 days earlier than any winter Elias could remember. Large, heavy, wet flakes. The kind that didn't drift down from the sky but dropped, like handfuls of white wool torn loose by an angry hand. By nightfall, the valley was unrecognizable. The wind didn't howl anymore. It screamed. It tore through Clearwater Pass like a blade, bending pines sideways, sending shutters slamming against cabin walls. Snow swirled so thick the entire world vanished beyond arm's reach. Light from windows dissolved into a swirling void. Footsteps disappeared seconds after they formed. And the temperature. It didn't fall gradually. It plummeted, like a stone dropped into a frozen lake. The rail line shut down by midnight. Telegraph wires snapped before dawn. Clearwater Pass might as well have been on the moon. No one got out. No one got in. The valley was caged in white. Elias sat inside the half-shaped shelter, breath trembling in the glow of a single candle. He had gathered his few supplies, rope, tools, 2 jars of dried beans, a small flask of oil, and pulled them inside the hollowed chamber. Outside, winter tore at the world with ferocity. But inside, he heard almost nothing. The wind rushed over the hill, not against it. Snow slammed into exposed cabins, but here it slid harmlessly across the curve of earth. The ground muffled everything: sound, vibration, even the cold that tried to seep in. All Elias could hear, in the stillness, was the steady drum of his own heartbeat. He pressed his back to the earthen wall, marveling at how the ground held heat. The shelter wasn't warm, not truly, but it was warmer than the outside world, and that difference mattered more than any grown man would have believed. He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "I was right. The land knows how to keep itself alive." For a moment, he let himself breathe, a long, deep breath that filled his lungs with something close to relief. But winter wasn't done with the valley. Not even close. At dawn on the second day of the storm, Elias stepped outside, only for a moment, only out of necessity. The world had changed shape. Snowdrifts clung to rooftops like white beasts. Barns stood cracked and half-collapsed, surrendering to the crushing weight of ice. He saw a cabin roof caved in, its timbers exposed like broken ribs. No smoke rose from chimneys. No figures moved through the storm. The valley wasn't just silent. It was suffering. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't supposed to be the one to help. He wasn't supposed to be the one making decisions. He was 16, a boy. But boys don't get to choose when the world needs them. Sometimes the world chooses first. He ducked back into the shelter before the wind peeled the warmth from his skin. He'd barely settled onto the packed earth when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to nature. 3 knocks. Soft, uncertain, desperate. He froze. Another knock. A trembling one, more frantic this time. He crawled toward the entrance, heart hammering against his ribs. Snow blew in through the narrow opening, stinging his hands. He wiped it away and peered into the blinding white. A shape leaned against the slope. A young woman, barely older than 20, with 2 children clinging to her sides. One boy, no older than 6. A little girl wrapped in a blanket, face blue with cold. Their mother's lips trembled as she whispered, "Please, anyone, please help us." Her voice was barely a voice at all, just broken edges of breath. Elias felt his spine stiffen. This wasn't some neighbor asking for a dry place to wait out the wind. This wasn't a friendly drop-in. This was life or death, pressed against his doorway. He looked at his shelter, small, half-finished, barely enough space for himself. He had food for one, water for one, heat preserved only by the grace of earth and roots. If he let them in, his resources would bleed out faster than the storm would end. If he didn't, they would die within the hour. He wasn't ready for this. No 16-year-old should be. But the world wasn't asking what he was ready for. It was asking who he was. The mother sagged forward, nearly collapsing. Elias caught her just before she slid into the snow. The boy looked up at him with hollow eyes. "Mister, please." "She can't breathe right," the little girl whimpered softly. A tiny fragile sound swallowed by the storm. Elias stared at them, at the storm, at the shelter. He thought of the men in town shaking their heads. He thought of being told he was just a boy. He thought of the hill they'd ignored, and the truth it had shown him. Survival wasn't about age. It was about choice. Slowly, with a trembling breath, he pulled the blanket tighter around the girl, lifted her into his arms and whispered, "Get inside, all of you, now." He didn't know what would come next, didn't know if they'd all survive, didn't know if the storm might outlast his supplies, his strength, or the hill itself. But one thing was certain: Elias Rowan had just made his first decision as a man, and winter was about to test every inch of it. Part 5. The shelter that should have failed. The shelter was never meant for more than one person. It was barely meant for one to begin with. Yet by the end of the second day of the storm, Elias Rowan had 9 people inside that earthen hollow. 9 bodies huddled in a space carved by a 16-year-old with nothing but stubbornness and a dull shovel. If the valley had seen it from above, they would have sworn it impossible. And yet, impossibility was exactly what held the group together. The mother and her 2 children were only the first. As the storm tightened its grip around Clearwater Pass, others staggered toward the ridge, drawn not by visible light, but by something quieter. Hope. A widower with frost-bitten hands. A ranch hand who'd lost his horse in the blizzard. 2 brothers separated from their hunting party. An elderly woman whose cabin chimney had collapsed in the night. And finally, limping through knee-deep snow with one hand clutching his cane, Caleb Horn. Elias helped each one inside, guiding them through the narrow entrance, brushing the ice from their shoulders as they crawled into the cramped, womb-like chamber. By dusk, the shelter felt less like a room and more like a single shared breath. Warm bodies pressed close. Knees and elbows overlapped. The air was damp with steam from melting snow on their clothes. No one complained, because no one dared imagine what waited for them outside. Elias took control not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. "We rotate sleeping," he said quietly, loud enough for every ear in the cramped space. 3 at a time. The rest stay sitting. We need room to breathe. He divided food next, a handful of dried beans each, barely enough to ease the ache, but enough to keep them alive. He assigned jobs, the widower to tend the small fire, the ranch hand to gather snow from outside for water, the older brothers to reinforce the timber ribs, the mother to watch over the children, Caleb to monitor the airflow, and the others listened. Not because he was loud, not because he commanded, but because he understood the shelter. And in that moment, understanding meant survival. The widower murmured, almost reverently, "All this, and the boy built it." Someone else added, "Nothing above ground is standing anymore." Elias didn't respond. He just checked the beams again, hands tracing the ropes, the roots, the curve of the earth. The fire crackled softly, just enough heat to keep death at bay, just small enough not to choke the air in the chamber. He placed his palm on the back wall, still warm, still dry, still strong. The hill hadn't failed them. Not yet. Hours blurred. Time hung in the dim amber glow of the candle, the fire, the breath of 9 frightened souls. The storm raged outside, sheets of white slamming against exposed cabins, piling snow against broken doors, swallowing fences whole. But inside the hill, it felt like another world. A world where wind didn't exist, where cold hesitated at the threshold, where sound was swallowed by earth. A world designed, not by a man, not by a carpenter, but by nature itself. And Elias had simply learned how to enter it. At some point past midnight, Caleb shifted toward him in the darkness. "You know," the old soldier whispered, voice low and gravelly, "when I saw you digging, I thought grief had taken your sense." Elias didn't look up. He was tightening a rope lash on one of the support beams. Caleb continued, the faintest tremor of admiration in his tone. "But I was wrong. We all were." Elias glanced at him then, the firelight glinting in the older man's weathered eyes. "You didn't hide from winter," Caleb said. "You understood it better than we did." The words struck Elias harder than any wind outside. He wasn't used to being believed. let alone trusted. He swallowed, unsure what to say. So he said nothing at all. Instead, he pressed his hand to the inner wall again. The earth throbbed faintly with muffled vibrations, distant, deep, ancient, not a threat. More like a heartbeat that had seen 1,000 storms before theirs. Still holding, still protecting, still alive. The shelter that should have failed, the shelter that any grown man would have dismissed as foolishness, had become the center of survival in Clearwater Pass. And at the center of that center, a 16-year-old boy kept watch, listening, calculating, keeping 9 souls alive in a space no bigger than a wagon stall. Outside, the storm showed no signs of slowing, but inside the hill, something else was growing. Confidence, trust, the beginnings of a story that no one in the valley would ever forget. And winter, cruel as it was, had finally met a mind it couldn't crush. Part 6. When the snow melted. When the storm finally broke, it didn't end with a roar. It ended with a whisper. 3 days after the blizzard swallowed Clearwater Pass, the wind fell silent. The sky opened, a pale blue bruised by the violence that had just passed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, sunlight touched the valley. But what the light revealed did not look like the Clearwater anyone remembered. Cabins, once sturdy, proud, standing against 100 winters, had collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. Rooftops lay buried. Fences vanished. Barns crumpled like paper left in the rain. Winter had not shown mercy. If you walked through the valley, the devastation felt endless. Timber splintered, windows shattered, doors blown off their hinges, chimneys torn away. The storm had taken anything that dared to stand tall. Anything exposed, anything that met the wind, head on. But halfway up the ridge, tucked beneath a forgotten slope, something else remained. The hill shelter. Untouched. Unbroken. As solid as the moment Elias Rowan placed his hands upon it. A small crooked trail of footprints led to the entrance. 9 sets of them, staggering and uneven, but alive. They emerged into the brightness like people waking from a dream. The widower cried openly. The ranch hand fell to his knees. The 2 brothers stared at the sun as if unsure it was real. The mother held her children close, faces tired, eyes red, but breathing. And behind them, stepping out last, came Elias, 16 years old, clothes torn from labor, hands cracked and scarred, eyes darker, wiser than any boy his age should ever have carried. The valley had not expected to owe its life to him, yet here they were, alive, because a boy listened to the land when no one listened to him. Word traveled fast, faster than the thaw. Neighbors hiked up the ridge to see the shelter for themselves, tracing fingers along the earthen walls, shaking their heads in disbelief. "It shouldn't have worked," someone whispered. "No," another replied, "but it did." Elias did not celebrate. He did not boast. He did not retell the story with dramatic flourish. He simply answered the questions people asked him. Why here? Why the hill? Why underground? And he told them plainly, the land already knew how to keep itself warm. I only followed its lead. Some men frowned, confused. Some women nodded slowly, but most listened in a new way. Quiet, humble, thoughtful. For the first time in his life, Elias didn't feel invisible. Not a prodigy, not a hero, but a teacher, not the kind who stands in front of a room. The kind who shows you something you walked past your whole life without noticing. Years passed. The valley rebuilt, but not in the same way. People dug into slopes instead of building atop them. They studied wind patterns, soil layers, root networks. They shaped their homes to fit the land, not fight it. And they always started the same way, by placing their palms on the earth, the way Elias had done. By the time 2 decades had gone by, Clearwater Pass had become known for earth-sheltered living. Not fancy, not expensive, just smart. Storm-proof cellars, root-warmed bunkhouses, hillside shelters designed for blizzards, blackouts, even wartime shortages. Travelers asked, "Who taught you this?" And the valley always answered, "A boy named Elias Rowan." He listened to the land. Elias grew older, but he never cashed in on his idea, never sold instructions, never patented a design. He shared everything freely, because survival wasn't an invention. It was a conversation. Between people, between families, between humans and the ground beneath their feet. In every lesson, he repeated the truth the storm had carved into him. Nature doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be understood. Years later, when Elias was a grown man with gray beginning to touch the edges of his beard, someone asked him how he survived the blizzard of 1907. He smiled softly and ran a hand across the slope of a new shelter his apprentices were building. "I didn't survive it," he said. "The hill did, and it let me stay." And so, when the valley tells his story, not as a myth, not as a miracle, but as a memory, they always end it the same way. They said he was too young to understand the land, but the land listened to him first. Because sometimes the safest place in the world is the one everyone else ignored. And sometimes the strongest wisdom comes from someone too young for adults to take seriously, until the snow melts and the truth stands unburied.